Have you ever woken up in the dead of night, feeling as though something was watching you from the darkness? I'm Kalen Ryan, a forensic artist who spends my days sketching the faces of the lost and forgotten, reconstructing their lives one fragment at a time. But there's a shadow in my own past that no amount of skill can unravel, a shadow that has begun to haunt me in ways I never thought possible. This story begins with a dream, one so vivid, so horrifying, that even now, I struggle to separate its echoes from reality. A dream of a shadow that didn't belong to me. The first time it happened, I was sitting alone in my studio, the glow of a single desk lamp casting long, warped shadows across the walls. My hand trembled as I finished a sketch of a man whose face had been pieced together from skeletal remains, an unsolved case from decades ago. Just as I put the pencil down, the room fell eerily silent. The familiar hum of the city outside vanished, replaced by a suffocating stillness that seemed to press against my chest. And then I saw it, a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye. A shadow stretching across the wall, its form wrong, unnatural, as though it were reaching for me. I blinked, and it was gone. But the feeling lingered, that unshakable sense of being watched. That night, sleep did not come easily. When it finally did, the dream was waiting for me. In the dream, I was standing in a place I didn't recognize. The air was cold, and the landscape was cloaked in mist so thick I could barely see my own hands. The ground beneath me was uneven, littered with jagged stones and fragments of broken glass that crunched underfoot. As I turned, trying to make sense of my surroundings, a deep, resonant hum filled the air. It was not a sound made by any living thing, more like the vibration of something massive shifting beneath the earth. Then I saw it, a shadow, separate from anything that could cast it, moving along the edges of my vision. It slithered and twisted, growing longer and darker, until it seemed to engulf the very air around me. My heart pounded as I tried to move, but my feet felt rooted in place. The shadow crept closer, inch by inch, and for the first time in my life, I felt the suffocating grip of true, paralyzing fear. Before I could scream, the shadow lunged forward, and I jolted awake in my bed, drenched in cold sweat. My room was silent, but the terror from the dream clung to me like a second skin. As I looked around, I caught a glimpse of something, just for a moment, darting across the wall. A shadow, moving independently of the faint moonlight streaming through the window. Before we go any deeper into this story, I need you to prepare yourself for what's to come. If you've ever felt the presence of something watching you from the darkness, you'll want to hear this tale to the very end. Subscribe to Nightmare Chronicles now, hit the notification bell, and remember, some shadows are more than they appear. They don't just follow you. Sometimes they choose you. It all began on a night like any other, or so I thought. Exhausted from a long day sketching faces of the lost, I fell into a restless sleep. Yet, this was no ordinary dream. I found myself standing in an unfamiliar place, a vast, decaying train station shrouded in an unsettling, pale twilight. The air was thick and heavy, carrying an acrid smell of rust and damp stone. The sound of dripping water echoed faintly, but the source was nowhere to be seen, and every drop felt like a clock ticking towards something inevitable. The station was abandoned, but it didn't feel empty. Faded posters clung to the walls, their words long eroded into illegibility. The floor was littered with shattered glass and debris, and with each step I took, the crunch beneath my feet sounded impossibly loud in the oppressive silence. Then came the déjà vu, an overwhelming sense that I had been here before, though I knew that was impossible. My breath quickened as the sensation tightened its grip on me. It wasn't just familiarity. It was as if the station remembered me. As I walked deeper into the labyrinthine corridors, I noticed something strange. The shadows cast by the dim, flickering lights weren't behaving as they should. They stretched and twisted unnaturally, reaching toward me like gnarled fingers. One shadow, larger and darker than the rest, caught my eye. It moved across the wall, independent of any object or light source, slithering like a living thing. My chest tightened with fear, but I couldn't look away. A cold wind swept through the station, carrying with it a sound I can only describe as a whisper. Not words, but a low, unintelligible murmur that seemed to come from every direction at once. My skin prickled as the whispers grew louder, morphing into faint, distorted laughter. I turned sharply, only to find the corridors stretching longer behind me, as if the station itself was alive and shifting, trapping me within its dark embrace. Ahead of me, a faint glow pierced the gloom, a single light emanating from a cracked door at the far end of the platform. It flickered like a dying flame, but it was enough to draw me closer, step by hesitant step. As I approached, the air grew colder, and the smell of rust was replaced by something far worse, something metallic and unmistakable. Blood. When I finally reached the door, I hesitated, my hand hovering just above the handle. From inside, I could hear faint breathing, slow and shallow, like someone or something was waiting for me. The whispers had stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. My heart raced as I pushed the door open, my curiosity overriding my fear. What lay beyond the threshold defied explanation and would forever alter my understanding of reality. The room beyond the door was cloaked in an unsettling darkness, interrupted only by the faint glow of a single swinging bulb. The light flickered erratically, casting jagged shadows that seemed to dance and writhe along the peeling walls. The smell of blood was stronger here, metallic and nauseating, mingling with the acrid stench of mildew. My first instinct was to turn and run, but something about the room held me captive, an invisible force pulling me deeper into its foreboding embrace. As I stepped inside, the door creaked shut behind me, the sound echoing like a final warning. The floor beneath my feet felt damp, the cold seeping through my shoes. I noticed strange markings carved into the walls, symbols I couldn't recognize but that seemed vaguely familiar, as though they had been etched somewhere deep in my subconscious. Each symbol pulsed faintly, their faint glow synchronized with the flickering bulb. The light made the shadows come alive, crawling across the room in unnatural patterns, their movements too deliberate to be random. In the center of the room was a table, and on it lay an object covered by a tattered cloth. The cloth was stained dark, its edges frayed as if it had been clawed at. My breath hitched as I hesitated, knowing that whatever was beneath it wasn't meant to be disturbed. But my curiosity was overpowering, and with trembling hands I reached out. The moment I touched the cloth, the temperature in the room plummeted. My fingers burned with the biting cold, and I yanked the cloth away. Beneath it lay an antique mirror, its surface cracked but somehow still reflecting the room around me with unsettling clarity. The cracks formed shapes that resembled the symbols on the walls, their jagged edges glowing faintly in the dim light. As I stared into the mirror, my own reflection looked back, but something was wrong. It wasn't moving in sync with me. The shadow I had seen earlier appeared in the reflection, standing just behind me, its form tall and hunched, its edges blurring as though it couldn't fully hold its shape. I spun around, but the room was empty. My heart pounded as I turned back to the mirror, only to find the shadow now inches away from my reflection, its hollow eyes fixed on me. The bulb above me began to swing violently, casting chaotic shadows that seemed to distort the room itself. The symbols on the walls flared brighter, pulsing with a rhythm that matched the frantic beating of my heart. The air grew thick, and an oppressive force pushed down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. Suddenly, the shadow in the mirror moved, reaching out with an arm that seemed to stretch impossibly far. I stumbled backward, but it wasn't enough. The shadow's hand pressed against the glass, and a deep, resonant hum filled the room. Cracks began to spread from the point of contact, crawling across the mirror like veins. The glass splintered with a deafening sound, and the room plunged into darkness. A voice, low and guttural, whispered from somewhere behind me, its words unintelligible but filled with malice. I turned, my eyes struggling to adjust, and there it was. The shadow had stepped out of the mirror, its form towering over me, its presence radiating an unbearable cold. It leaned closer, its hollow eyes piercing through me, as if it could see my very soul. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the light returned. The room was empty, the mirror shattered on the table. I was alone, but the feeling of being watched lingered, wrapping around me like a shroud. The shattered mirror seemed to pulse faintly on the table, its jagged shards reflecting fragments of the room like broken memories. Each piece caught the dim light, creating strange, shifting patterns that seemed almost deliberate. My breathing was shallow, each inhale cutting through the thick tension that had overtaken the air. The shadow was gone, at least I thought it was, but the room carried its presence like a wound, raw and bleeding. I tried to steady myself, but then I noticed something strange. The symbols on the walls were no longer faint etchings. They were glowing brighter now, their light pulsating in unison, as if alive. My heart sank as the markings began to shift, rearranging themselves into patterns that defied logic, almost as though they were spelling something out. My mind screamed for me to leave, but my body wouldn't move, frozen in a state of primal fear. Then, the whispers returned, louder this time, and distinctly layered, as if multiple voices were speaking over one another. They came from everywhere and nowhere all at once. I could make out fragments of words, broken, ancient syllables that clawed at my sanity. Chosen, one voice hissed. Not escape, another growled. My pulse thundered in my ears, each beat a countdown to something inevitable. Suddenly, a loud creak echoed through the room. I whipped around to see the door slowly opening on its own, the hallway beyond now shrouded in complete darkness. A faint vibration under my feet began to grow, shaking the room as if something massive was approaching from deep within the void. The broken shards of the mirror trembled on the table, some sliding off and shattering further on the floor. My reflection, or what should have been my reflection, appeared in one of the larger fragments. But it wasn't me. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, like a marionette controlled by an unseen force. Its face twisted into a grotesque grin, and its lips moved without sound. Then, the image's hollow eyes locked onto mine. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. I was transfixed, trapped in its gaze. The figure in the glass leaned closer, pressing its face against the jagged edge of the shard. Its voice echoed directly into my mind, bypassing my ears entirely. You've seen us. Now we see you. Before I could react, the room exploded with light. A deep, guttural roar reverberated through the space, and the shadows sprang to life. They twisted and swirled, taking on forms that defied comprehension. Tendrils of darkness snaked toward me, wrapping around my legs and arms. I struggled against them, but their grip was ice-cold and unyielding, draining the strength from my body. In the center of the chaos, a new figure emerged, tall and menacing, its form shifting and rippling like smoke. It was the shadow, but this time it was fully formed, its edges sharp and defined. Its hollow eyes bore into mine, and for the first time it spoke clearly. You brought us here. I tried to scream, but my voice was stolen, caught in my throat. The symbols on the walls pulsed violently, their glow now almost blinding. The room seemed to warp around me, the walls stretching and twisting, pulling me toward the shadow. My vision blurred, and the last thing I saw before the darkness consumed me was the figure's outstretched hand, its jagged fingers inches from my face. Then, everything went black. I woke up gasping for air, drenched in sweat, my heart hammering in my chest. My room was silent, the familiar surroundings of my apartment offering little comfort. But something was wrong. The corner of the room seemed darker than it should have been, as if the shadow had followed me back. And then faintly I saw it, etched into the wall above my desk. One of the symbols from the dream, glowing faintly, pulsing in time with my heartbeat. What would you do if your nightmares started leaving marks on your reality? Tell me your theories in the comments below. If this story has sent shivers down your spine, hit the like button and subscribe to Nightmare Chronicles. Together, we'll keep unraveling the mysteries of the unknown. But be warned, not all answers bring peace. Sometimes the shadows take more than they give. The dream haunted me long after I woke, its images burned into my mind like scars that refused to heal. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that it had been more than just a nightmare. As I went about my day, echoes of that shadow seemed to linger in the corners of my vision. Every flicker of movement, every shadow cast by the sunlight, filled me with an unshakable dread. It wasn't just paranoia, I knew something wasn't right. Unable to focus, I sat down at my desk, determined to confront the unsettling images in my mind. I began sketching the symbols I had seen on the walls of the dream, their shapes flowing from my memory as if they had always been there, just waiting to be drawn. The process was hypnotic, and when I finally stopped to look at the page, my breath caught in my throat. The symbols felt ancient. They carried a weight, as though they had existed long before me, long before anything I could comprehend. I decided to research them, hoping to find some logical explanation. At first, my searches yielded nothing, but then I stumbled across an obscure forum dedicated to the paranormal. Someone had posted an old photograph of a decaying train station, the exact one from my dream. My stomach dropped as I read the caption, Briar Hollow Station, site of unexplained disappearances and strange phenomena. Locals call it the Station of Shadows. My hands trembled as I clicked on the post. The user described sightings of a shadowy figure that seemed to move on its own, independent of any light source. Those who saw it claimed it followed them, tormenting them in their dreams until they disappeared without a trace. The dates listed in the post spanned decades, yet no explanation had ever been found. I scrolled through the comments, each one more chilling than the last. People claimed to have seen the same symbols I had drawn, etched into walls, floors, even carved into trees near the station. My heart raced as I dug deeper. I found an old news article detailing the unexplained death of a station worker who had been found with no visible injuries, his face frozen in an expression of pure terror. The article mentioned an investigation into reports of strange noises and shadows moving on their own in the station, but the case was quickly closed without resolution. The more I read, the more the lines between dream and reality blurred. Every detail of the station in the articles matched my dream perfectly, down to the faint glow of the symbols on the walls. The weight of it all pressed down on me like a stone, but I couldn't stop. I needed answers. Desperate for more information, I reached out to locals who had commented on the forum. One of them, an older man named Elias, responded almost immediately. His message was brief but chilling. If you saw the shadow in your dreams, it's already too late. It means it's marked you. You need to stay away from Briar Hollow, no matter what. But it was already too late to stay away. The pull of the station was irresistible, like a dark thread tied around my soul, dragging me toward it. The shadow wasn't just a figment of my imagination. It was something real, something alive, and it was connected to me in ways I couldn't understand. That night, the dream came again. The same station, the same oppressive air, the same shadow. But this time, the symbols on the walls were clearer, their meaning just out of reach. The shadow moved closer, its hollow eyes boring into me. It didn't speak, but somehow, I understood its message. Come to us. I woke in a cold sweat, gasping for air. The symbol I had drawn earlier was now faintly glowing on the wall above my desk, just as it had in the dream. My body trembled as the realization set in. The shadow wasn't waiting for me to find it. It was already here. I couldn't ignore it any longer. Every waking moment was consumed by the shadow. Its presence clung to me like an invisible weight. The symbols burned in my mind, and their faint glow on my wall refused to fade. Each night, the dreams grew darker, more vivid, and I woke with a creeping certainty that they weren't just dreams. They were messages, invitations from something ancient and hungry. Against every instinct screaming at me to stay away, I decided to go to Briar Hollow Station. The journey there was drenched in unease. The sky darkened unnaturally as I approached, clouds swirling overhead in ominous patterns. When I arrived, the air seemed heavier, oppressive, as if the station itself exhaled a sinister energy. The once abandoned structure loomed before me, its decayed walls coated in moss and graffiti. But beneath the layers of grime, I could make out faint carvings, symbols like the ones I had seen in my dream. My pulse quickened. This wasn't a coincidence. The first step onto the platform was like crossing a threshold into another world. The air was colder here, biting against my skin even though it was the middle of summer. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the faint echo of my footsteps. Yet there was something else, an almost imperceptible hum, low and rhythmic, like a heartbeat reverberating through the stone. As I ventured further, the shadows seemed to deepen unnaturally, stretching and bending in ways that defied logic. My flashlight flickered, its beam swallowed by the dense darkness ahead. Every corner I turned felt like stepping into a trap, and the sensation of being watched grew stronger with each passing moment. Then I saw him, a man standing at the far end of the platform, his figure barely illuminated by the dim light of a rusting lamppost. His face was lined with age and something else, fear. He introduced himself as Elias, the man who had warned me in the forum. His voice trembled as he spoke. "You shouldn't have come here," he whispered, his eyes darting nervously to the shadows. "Once the shadow marks you, it doesn't let go. You've felt it, haven't you? The dreams, the symbols, the pull." I nodded, my throat too dry to speak. Elias continued, his words laced with desperation. "This place isn't just haunted, it's alive. It feeds on people like you, the ones it calls. The shadow, it's not just a thing. It's part of the station, part of something older than we can imagine. And once you're marked, it follows you, even if you leave." Before I could ask more, Elias's expression twisted into terror. He grabbed my arm, his grip ironclad. "It's here," he hissed, his voice barely audible. The hum grew louder, vibrating through the platform. The shadows around us began to shift, slithering toward us like living entities. I turned my flashlight toward them, but the beam only seemed to anger them, their forms twisting and writhing more violently. Elias pulled me into a side corridor, his movements frantic. "Whatever you do, don't stop moving," he said. "If it catches you, you won't leave this place." The corridor was narrow and suffocating, its walls covered in more of the strange carvings. The symbols pulsed faintly, casting an eerie glow that did little to illuminate the path ahead. The whispers began again, louder this time, their overlapping voices creating a cacophony that made it impossible to think. We emerged into a larger room, its walls lined with old, rusting lockers. In the center was a broken bench, and on it lay an object wrapped in a dirty cloth. Elias froze, his face pale. "That's not supposed to be here," he muttered, his voice trembling. I stepped closer, drawn to the object despite the dread clawing at my chest. When I pulled back the cloth, I found a journal, its leather cover cracked and worn. Inside were pages filled with sketches of the shadow, the same symbols, and detailed accounts of dreams nearly identical to mine. Each entry ended the same way: "The shadow has chosen me. I can't escape." A loud crash echoed behind us, and Elias's face turned white. "It's too late," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the growing hum. "It knows you're here." The room seemed to collapse in on itself as the shadows poured in, their forms merging into a single, towering figure. It was the shadow, fully formed, its hollow eyes burning with an unnatural light. It reached toward me, and as its tendrils wrapped around my arm, an icy pain shot through my body. Elias screamed, "Run," but I couldn't move. The shadow's grip tightened, pulling me closer. My vision blurred, and the last thing I heard before the darkness consumed me was its voice, a deep, guttural whisper. "You belong to us now." The room seemed to warp and shift as the shadow loomed over me, its massive form devouring what little light remained. The air turned cold, so cold that my breath emerged in trembling white clouds. The shadows twisted and writhed like a living sea, pulling me toward the figure in the center of the room. Its hollow eyes burned with an intensity that pierced straight through me, exposing every fear I'd tried to bury. In its presence, the weight of the station's history bore down on me. Fractured images flashed through my mind, people screaming in the dark, hands clawing at unseen horrors, and that same shadow, always watching, always waiting. It wasn't just a force of terror, it was a collector of souls, a living void that thrived on despair and fear. My body trembled as I fought to pull away, but the shadow's grip tightened around me, its icy tendrils sinking deeper into my skin. The symbols carved into the walls flared to life, glowing with an otherworldly light that painted the room in flickering shadows. For a brief moment, I felt the weight of 1,000 voices pressing against my mind, whispers of those who had come before me, trapped and consumed. Elias shouted something from across the room, but his words were drowned out by a deafening roar that erupted from the shadow. The sound was inhuman, a guttural noise that seemed to reverberate through the walls, shaking the very foundation of the station. Then, as if in answer to its call, the symbols began to shift again, rearranging themselves into a pattern that pulsed with dark energy. At the center of this chaos, my eyes fell upon an object lying on the floor, a small, weathered pendant, its surface engraved with the same symbols that haunted my dreams. I didn't know how I knew, but I was certain it held the key to everything. I lunged for it, ignoring the searing cold that radiated from the shadow as I broke free of its grasp. The moment my fingers closed around the pendant, the room erupted in chaos. The shadows recoiled violently, their forms distorting into jagged, unnatural shapes. The symbols on the walls pulsed faster and brighter, their glow burning into my vision. The pendant grew unbearably hot in my hand, but I refused to let go. Then, the shadow spoke, not in whispers, but in a voice so deep and resonant that it seemed to echo from the depths of the earth itself. "You were chosen. You cannot escape." Its words carried a weight that pressed against my chest, stealing the air from my lungs. But as the pendant's heat seared into my palm, a sudden surge of clarity washed over me. The shadow wasn't invincible. It drew its power from fear, from submission. And in that moment, I realized that my survival depended on defiance. Summoning every ounce of courage I had left, I held the pendant aloft and shouted, "You don't own me." The words felt foreign in my mouth, but the effect was immediate. The symbols on the walls flared brighter than ever before, their light slicing through the shadow like blades. It howled in rage, its form unraveling as the room seemed to collapse around us. Elias grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the door. "This isn't over," he yelled as we stumbled out of the room, the shadow's anguished screams echoing behind us. The station itself seemed to fight against us, the walls shifting and closing in, but we kept moving, the light from the pendant guiding our way. We finally burst onto the platform, gasping for air as we emerged into the pale, pre-dawn light. Behind us, the station groaned, its structure warping as though it was alive and in pain. For a brief moment, I thought we had escaped, but then I noticed the faint outline of the shadow in the distance, watching us from the darkness. Elias turned to me, his face grim. "You've wounded it, but it's not gone," he said. "It's tied to you now. Wherever you go, it will follow." I looked down at the pendant in my hand, its surface now cool but still glowing faintly with the symbols that had marked my nightmare. I knew he was right. The shadow wasn't finished with me, not yet. The days that followed felt like living in a waking nightmare. Though I had escaped Briar Hollow Station, its shadows never left me. At first, it was subtle, a fleeting chill in a warm room, a flicker of movement at the edge of my vision. But as the nights passed, the signs grew impossible to ignore. The pendant, which I kept hidden in a drawer, pulsed faintly with the same eerie light I had seen on the walls of the station. It was as though it had a heartbeat of its own, faint but persistent, a reminder that the shadow wasn't done with me. One night, I woke to find the symbols from the station scrawled across my bedroom walls, their glow faint but undeniable. My heart thundered as I stumbled out of bed, my hands trembling as I ran them over the markings. They weren't painted or etched, they were simply there, as if the room itself had absorbed the station's curse. I scrubbed at them, but they refused to fade. Instead, they pulsed in rhythm with the pendant, their light growing stronger with every beat. As the symbols burned brighter, the whispers returned. They slithered through the air like venom, filling the room with a dissonant hum that made my head throb. I couldn't understand the words, but their intent was clear. The shadow was coming. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows stretching unnaturally toward me, their edges sharp and jagged. In the corner of the room, the darkness coalesced into a familiar form. It was the shadow, as tall and menacing as I remembered, its hollow eyes burning with malice. It stood silently for a moment, its presence suffocating. Then it stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate, each step sending a chill through my body. I tried to scream, but the air seemed to thicken, choking the sound before it could leave my throat. The pendant on my nightstand began to glow more intensely, its light cutting through the darkness like a blade. The shadow recoiled slightly, its edges flickering, but it didn't retreat. Instead, it raised an arm, pointing toward the pendant. A voice, deep and guttural, filled the room, not coming from the shadow itself, but from everywhere at once. "You brought this upon yourself," it said, each word reverberating through my skull. "The mark cannot be undone." In a desperate attempt to break its hold, I grabbed the pendant, its surface scorching my palm as I held it tightly. The room erupted in chaos. The symbols on the walls flared brighter than ever, and the shadow let out a deafening roar. The whispers crescendoed into screams, overlapping and overwhelming, until I couldn't distinguish them from my own thoughts. The air grew colder, frost creeping along the walls as the shadow lunged toward me. And then, everything stopped. I woke up on the floor, my head pounding and my body drenched in sweat. The symbols were gone, the whispers silenced, but the pendant lay cold and heavy in my hand. The room was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that pressed against your ears and made your skin crawl. But I knew better than to believe it was truly over. In the following days, I tried to return to normalcy, but the shadow's presence lingered. I saw its outline in reflective surfaces, caught its movement in my peripheral vision. Even when I was surrounded by people, I felt its gaze, an oppressive weight that never wavered. And the pendant, it began to appear in places I hadn't left it, as though it had a will of its own. One morning, I woke to find the symbol from the station carved into the wood of my desk. Beneath it were 3 words, scratched deep into the surface: "You are chosen." The shadow hasn't taken me yet, but I can feel it growing stronger, its grip tightening with every passing day. And the worst part, I'm starting to think the shadow isn't just following me. It's spreading. Do you think the shadow is bound to me, or could it be looking for its next victim? Look around. Are you truly alone? Share your theories in the comments below, and if this story has left you questioning the darkness, hit that like button and subscribe to Nightmare Chronicles. Together, we'll face the shadows that lurk in the corners of our world. But remember, some stories don't end when the video stops. Sometimes they follow you home.